Picture this. You're deep in the woods, completely alone. Your campfire crackles softly in front of your tent, casting eerie shadows on the trees. Then you hear it. Nothing. The forest around you falls silent, completely silent, and all you can feel is fear. In this episode, we're uncovering the eerie and unexplained with a fresh set of stories that will make you think twice before going out in the woods alone. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, these stories have a way of creeping under your skin. So grab your favorite blanket, get cozy, and let's enjoy. If you like the stories, please subscribe. I've been sitting on this story for a while, and I haven't spoken a word of it to any of my coworkers, afraid they'd ridicule me. But with the recent string of stories, I finally worked up the nerve to share it. A few years ago, I did an aircrew survival training course with the Army, where we learned everything you'd need to survive in the woods for an extended period of time if your aircraft went down. The course covered everything from wild edibles to signaling overhead aircraft for help. But the final test was one of the most challenging and terrifying experiences of my life. We had to hike 10 miles into the woods, find a clearing, and set up camp. Sounds easy, right? Well, we had nothing but a combat knife, a field ration, and a very basic med kit. Our instructor told us that after an incident the previous year, where someone succumbed to the toll of isolation, a combination of loneliness, boredom, and the crushing feeling that you won't be rescued can drive even the most experienced outdoorsman mad, we were required to remove our belts and leave them at base. We drove out in a 3-ton truck along a logging road to our drop-off point. Each of us was assigned a specific grid location, all at least 5 miles apart from one another. My grid was nearly an 8-mile hike through densely wooded marshland. Once we arrived at our spots, we were instructed to radio in when we reached our destination. However, when I got to mine, I found that my grid put me in the middle of a pond, so I camped on the shore instead, obviously. I got my bearings, planned out my shelter, and settled in for the 5-night stay, completely alone. Since the weather was good, I figured I wouldn't need much in the way of shelter, so I focused more on food and water collection. There was a stream just outside my camp, which made water easy to find. I spent the first day setting traps for small game, pitfalls, rabbit snares, and deadfall traps. Feeling ambitious, I even set up a swing spike trap for deer. Essentially, I bent a strong tree branch back, attached several sharp spears to it, and connected it to a tripwire system. I was pretty proud of myself. That trap could have easily taken down a medium-sized deer. The first few nights were uneventful, aside from the distant howls of wolves. For the first time in my life, I heard nothing but the woods. It was surreal. On the 3rd night, I heard the swing trap go off. It made a hell of a noise when it hit the tree beside it, which was disappointing. It meant the trap had missed its target. I woke late the next morning with the sun already high in the sky. First thing on my mind was to check the traps, as I hadn't eaten since the 2nd night, and my stomach was running on nothing but water. When I went to reset the swing trap, I noticed something strange. There was blood on one of the spears. The wound must have been deep, as the blood covered the first 2 inches of the spear. But even stranger, near the trap, I saw what looked like a man's bare footprint. I hadn't taken my boots off outside the shelter, and as far as I knew, there was nobody else around for miles. A wave of unease washed over me, knowing someone was out there, wounded. What really puzzled me was the lack of a blood trail, especially with an injury that severe. The trap would have hit the person square in the hip. I went back to camp and munched on some nearby cucumber leaves and berries. Cucumber leaf is a local plant in the Canadian Maritimes, with broad leaves that taste just like cucumber. But guilt soon crept over me. I might have seriously injured some innocent wanderer or a hermit living in the woods. I'd been given very strict instructions not to go more than 200 feet outside my grid bubble, but I couldn't shake the feeling I should help. I decided to radio in the incident to command. They told me someone would look into it. About 15 minutes later, I heard a chopper circling overhead for 5 minutes, land about a mile away, and then quickly leave. Must have been an air ambulance to pick up the poor guy. The fourth night was unnervingly quiet. No bugs humming, no wolves, no wind, nothing. It was the closest thing to silence I've ever heard. Suddenly, every hair on my body stood on end, like the air had been electrically charged. I felt like I was being watched, not just that uneasy feeling you get when you're alone in the woods. I knew I was being watched. A quick gust of wind blew over my shelter, and the air was freezing cold. I could see my breath. Then the deer trap went off again. This time, it didn't hit the tree. I was scared stiff, refusing to leave my shelter to investigate. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a cough, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost mechanical, like one of those electronic voice boxes some people use, and it was rhythmic, one cough every 2 seconds or so. That cough was the only sound. The woods remained eerily quiet. I forced myself to peek out of my shelter to see what was making that noise. Just outside, I saw a barefoot with tattered jeans around the ankle. I was petrified. I pulled back inside my shelter, and for the first time in my life, I accepted death. If whoever was out there wanted to kill me, they could. I cried myself to sleep that night. I stayed inside my shelter for the next day and night, too terrified to venture out. I was finally woken on the 6th day by my sergeant, who had come to check on me. It was well past noon, and he was worried that I'd been injured on my way back to the extraction point. During the hike back to base, I asked him about the chopper. He told me not to worry about it. I let it go for about 10 minutes before asking again. Seeing that I was genuinely concerned, he finally answered, "It was a body recovery. Corporal J hung himself with a rope he made. You were friends, right?" He asked, like he already knew the answer, and handed me a note and added, "Perhaps it'll make more sense to you." It read, "I tracked him to your site. I know I shouldn't have, but I did." He kept coughing and whispering in a language I had never heard before, but somehow understood. He wanted a soul. He told me to do this to save you. The man with black eyes wanted you. I was hunting, about a mile off the road, deep in the forest near the old state highway. It was a spot I'd been to a few times before, way off the beaten path where most hunters wouldn't bother going. Isolated, dense, and quiet. The kind of place where you could spend a whole day and not see another soul. It was perfect for hunting, or at least it used to be. This one time, I got a really creepy feeling. It was the kind of sensation that crawls under your skin and sits in the back of your mind, whispering that you're not alone. Something, or someone, was watching me, and I knew for certain there was more than one set of eyes on me. I tried to blow it off. Why wouldn't I? I'm a middle-aged man, big enough that anyone would think twice before messing with me. Whether it's fat or muscle under the layers, I'm not sure. But either way, I figured no one would choose me as an easy target. So I kept scouting. I wasn't about to let a weird feeling cut my day short. That's when I saw it. A lady's sock. Strange, but these things happen. Stuff blows around, people leave things behind. Maybe some hikers got careless. About 50 yards further, I see a shoe. Now that got me thinking. A sock and a shoe, both women's. Someone was definitely having a bad day. But what really got me was the constant sensation that I was being watched. I couldn't shake it. No matter how much I tried to convince myself, it was nothing. The forest was quieter than before. No birds, no rustling of small animals. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. My nerves started to get the best of me. The trees felt like they were closing in, and the shadows grew longer, even though the sun hadn't moved much. I scolded myself, telling myself not to be such a coward. I'm a grown man, after all. It's just the woods. The sock and shoe looked old, worn down by time and weather. Probably been there a while. I forced myself to keep walking, but then I saw it. A pair of women's jeans, half covered by leaves and dirt. Now I was freaking out. This wasn't just someone dropping a piece of clothing. This was something far worse. I wasn't within shouting distance of anyone. Not that I would have wanted to yell anyway. She hadn't been either. And whoever, or whatever, was watching me wasn't letting up. I could feel the weight of those eyes pressing down on me. I scanned the trees, trying to place where the feeling was coming from. My heart was hammering in my chest, every instinct telling me to turn around and run. But then, deep in the woods, I saw it. A shape, low to the ground, like someone crouching behind the undergrowth. My stomach dropped, but I told myself I wasn't a coward. Maybe it was another hunter. I could walk over, say hi, and get the hell out of here with some shred of my pride intact. So I started walking toward it, forcing my legs to move despite the fear gnawing at me. But then I realized that wasn't a person. It was a woman's blouse, draped over a bush. And that was it for me. I was done. I wasn't sticking around to see if there was a body somewhere nearby. The woods were dead silent now, like they were waiting for something. I turned to leave, moving quickly, heart pounding in my throat. Then, about 50 yards away, 2 deer exploded out of the brush, crashing through the undergrowth as they bolted away from me. That was the final push I needed. At that moment, I didn't care about hunting anymore. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and once I was inside, I peeled out of there without looking back. When I got home, I called the police. I told them what I found, told them something wasn't right out there, but I didn't follow up. I never called back to see what happened. I didn't want to know. That place still haunts my nightmares. The sock, the shoe, the jeans, the blouse, and the eyes. Before I get into it, I need to put out a quick disclaimer. I was 18 when this happened. I've never done hard drugs, I don't drink alcohol, and I didn't even start smoking until I was 22. Also, 3 other people were with me that night. Sober teenagers, all of us, and they saw it too. So, it was a Friday night after school, and my friend and I were hanging out with 2 of her guy friends. We were supposed to have a sleepover at her place, but since we lived in a small Georgia town with not much to do, we ended up just walking around town square and heading over to some nearby trails. After a couple hours of goofing around, we got hungry and ordered a pizza for pickup. Once we had the pizza, we drove to a quiet neighborhood where one of the guys lived. It was one of those areas tucked away into the woods, super quiet, and pitch black at night. We parked, sat outside using the hood of the car as a makeshift table, and started eating. While we were there, I looked up and noticed this big, pitch-black mass in the trees. It was shaped like a primate, and it moved like one too, swinging through the trees. But here's the thing. It had to be at least 100 feet away, and even at that distance I could tell it was huge. But that didn't make any sense. We're in a small town in Georgia. There are no large primates here. I pointed it out to everyone, and we were all just staring at it, trying to figure out what we were looking at. A sense of dread washed over me as I kept my eyes on this thing, trying to make sense of it. Then, it felt like it noticed us. We couldn't see any distinct features. It was just this pitch-black shadow. But somehow we all knew it was watching us. Suddenly the figure stood up, and you could see it shifting. It started to look more like a huge man, holding onto a branch with one arm, staring right at us. The air around us got so still, like even the sounds of the night froze with us. We were transfixed, staring at this thing in the trees, too terrified to move. Then it crouched down, and as it did, its shoulders seemed to stretch impossibly high, like they were reaching over its head. We were in shock, struggling to process what we were seeing, because none of it made any sense. And then, right in front of us, its shoulders seemed to grow into massive wings. The figure jumped off the branch and flew away. I know what we saw was real because the second it happened, we all ran to the car. No words, just screams, and sped out of there. We were freaking out, trying to find some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. None of us slept that night, terrified that whatever that thing was, it might follow us back to my friend's house. I grew up in rural Appalachia, so I was surrounded by all kinds of superstitions and legends about ghosts and other creepy things. As an adult, I realized most of those stories were probably just ways to scare kids from wandering off into the woods, passed down through the generations. I was always told to never respond if something called my name in the woods, and if you heard whistling outside at night, it meant the devil was close. Of course, there's some truth and valuable advice in those tales. If a stranger is calling your name in the woods or whistling outside your house at night, it's probably a good idea to be afraid, especially as a child. But personally, I never experienced anything like that in the mountains. The scariest thing that ever happened to me wasn't even supernatural, and it happened in New Mexico. My mom passed away when I was really young, and when I was 20, my dad died too, leaving me with just my brother as my only immediate family. Dad didn't have much, but he left his house to my brother and just enough money to me to buy 2 acres and a nice used camper. My boyfriend, now my husband, wanted to move back home to be close to his mom, and we planned to eventually build a house. It felt like an adventure at the time. We were literally in the desert, a dirt lot off a dirt road with no electricity or water access, surrounded by other identical empty plots. Up until recently, you could still find land like that for next to nothing, because it's so inconvenient and expensive to live out there comfortably. We had to haul water from my in-laws' house and use a generator for electricity. My husband worked nights as a security guard, so I was alone in the camper almost every night. It was boring, but it felt safe enough because we had Zeus, a huge Rottweiler who would have defended either of us to the death. But as I'd come to find out, dog or not, it wasn't really that safe. One night, like any other, I'd been outside watching the sky while smoking, and then came back inside to get ready for bed. I had just undressed and climbed into bed when I heard whistling and felt the camper shift, like a hard gust of wind hit it. Wind gusts weren't unusual out there, so I might have ignored it, except Zeus started growling like the devil himself was outside. He was crouched toward the door, ready to attack. That's when I realized how foolish it was to think I was safe out there, with just a thin aluminum door between me and whatever was out in the dark. My granddad's old stories about whistling at night flashed through my mind, and though I'm not very religious, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't praying in that moment. The whistle was so high-pitched it almost sounded like the wind, but not quite. It had a sad, eerie melody to it. Plus, my dog had never growled at the wind before. What really freaked me out was that I could hear it over the generator, yet I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded like it was everywhere. I wanted to peek outside, but I was frozen in bed. Zeus was going wild, growling, snarling, pacing. He rarely barked, but when he did, it was terrifying. When he started barking at the wall like he was possessed, everything just stopped. It was like the tension in the air slowly dissipated. Zeus was still shaken, though, and didn't calm down until I finally let him out, about an hour later. He sniffed around the back of the camper, right under the bedroom window, for a good minute before reluctantly coming back inside. I was too scared to go out myself. Back then, we had flip phones, and cell service was spotty at best, so I had no way to call for help or leave. The next morning, when I told my husband what happened, he was convinced it was traffickers or someone worse trying to break in on me, but Zeus scared them off. It made sense, but I didn't feel like that was the answer. No one had actually tried to break in, and who would just stand outside whistling? Then he mentioned hearing rumors about a small cult living somewhere out there, and maybe it was them trying to scare us away. That was even more terrifying to me, because if it was a cult, they could come back. In the daylight, with my husband there, the idea seemed a bit silly. But when I remembered Zeus sniffing around the back of the camper, we decided to go check it out. The dirt out there is soft and sandy, and it looked like it had been trampled by several people with different-sized bare feet. The weirdest part? The tracks were only under the small window over our bed. There were no tracks leading away from the camper, just the ones outside the window and one set halfway around the back, exactly where Zeus had started barking. Suddenly, that cult rumor didn't seem so silly, and that's how I ended up living with my mother-in-law for over a year. There was no way I was going to keep living out there, in fear of being harassed, or worse. We still own that lot, but now we live in town. The desert is beautiful, and I love hiking in it with others, but I've noticed something about it seems to attract some really crazy people. We hope these stories sent a chill down your spine. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? We'd love to hear about it. Share your story in the comments below or send it to us directly so we can feature it in a future video. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support helps us keep these eerie tales coming. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there. You never know what's lurking in the dark.